Good morning, everyone. Fair enough. This is a session on previous year's question papers when it comes to reading comprehension. We'll start with 2019 onwards, right? Now, ordinarily, this is a session which could be very, very useful for people who think that reading comprehension is their strength, right? Normally, in a reading comprehension, what is tested, right? Primarily, what is tested is whether you can pick the language of the passage or not, which is to say, do you have enough words in your own vocabulary to understand what has been written in the text? Second, it's not just the language, it's also, more importantly, what is the message that is being conveyed by the author? This is very, very important. For you to understand the message conveyed by the author, right, you need to be able to pick on the language of the author and, more importantly, also the tone of writing. Which is to say, some authors may be extremely optimistic, some authors may be cynical, may be pessimistic. You will have to understand what the tone of the passage also is. In addition, what is usually also asked is, what are the main arguments? To convey the message, there are certain arguments which are made by the author. There could be main arguments, there could even be supporting arguments. Right, to understand these aforementioned things, right, the only thing you have to look at is, one, whether you know how to navigate a reading comprehension, generally speaking, or not. Which is to say that you will have to answer the following types of questions. Some questions will be directly main argument questions. Some questions may even ask you what are the supporting arguments. Some questions may even ask you what is the message conveyed by the author of the passage. Sometimes they may cloak it and tell you what is the crux of the passage, generally speaking, right? These are the more common kinds of questions. One more type of question is implication-based questions. Implications, inferences, etc. Right? Normally speaking, if you attempt any reading comprehension, what is presumed is that this passage will mostly be about the language of the passage, not the substance. In a reading comprehension, if you take it for any other exam, what is more important is this, right? It is not important for you to understand the substance. That means this passage could be about anything under the sun. This passage could be about science, technology. This passage could be about policy. This passage could be about economics. This passage could be about environment, biodiversity. You do not need to be an expert there. So long as you are able to pick the language of the passage, right? Questions will basically be checking whether you understand complicated writing or not. Whether you are able to decipher what is the main message being conveyed by the passage directly or what is being implied, right? That is what is checked. In UPSC, however, all of these things will be checked, but more importantly, you will be also required to know this part, which is to say, right, this passage could be about anything, right? Do you understand that underlying concepts or not? This is why UPSC's reading comprehension is fundamentally different from any other reading comprehension, which is why the best kind of practice, if you will ever get from reading comprehension, will happen only if you take previous year's question papers. No other reading comprehension comes even close to what UPSC asks, primarily because of this reason. They may ask you a question on economic policies. They will want you to understand what are the underlying things. Most likely, they are going to ask you questions on implications also, assumptions also. Right? You need to understand what is being spoken of. Right? Ordinarily, how you will cover a reading comprehension is that whatever facts are mentioned in the passage, you do not question those facts. These are the only facts within which you will have to operate. They form the framework, right? All the questions are related to what has been mentioned in the passage. Your understanding of the substance therein is going to only help you decipher what the meaning of the passage is, right? From your understanding of general studies, you may know some facts as are being presented. Maybe they are one-sided. Maybe those facts are factually wrong, right? Or maybe whatever the message is being conveyed is something wrong. That is not where you have to go. You have to remain well within the scope of the passage itself. And every question is related to what has been mentioned in the passage only, right? So you have to always stay within the scope of the passage. Do not go beyond it. The only instance where you're allowed a little bit to go beyond the scope of the passage is if the questions are on implications, on consequences, or solutions. That is where you can go slightly beyond the scope of the passage, right? Because that kind of a question is going to check whether you understand the passage or not. Most likely it will be some issue, right? What could be the proposed solutions to those issues? Which is exactly why your understanding of the substance is also going to come in handy, right? The solutions which are being proposed, whether they are a solution to that problem or not, right? This is why UPSC's reading comprehension is fundamentally different. Therefore, whichever technique you have developed to solve reading comprehensions is not going to come in handy when it comes to reading comprehensions of UPSC. In UPSC, the only things you have to realize is, one, that you do not want to be too concerned with the semantics. Semantics ka matlab kya? You may be getting a question on assumptions, corollaries, implications, things like that. Do not get too stuck with what the question has been, right? Secondly, do not use your common tricks, which is, oh, if this word was mentioned in the passage, this option has to be correct. Ordinarily, in a reading comprehension, you actually go out looking for the right answer. In UPSC, you have to do the other way around. You have to look at each option, right? And then you have to assess why every option should be wrong, right? That option for which you have the least number of reasons to believe that this option would be wrong is usually the right answer, right? This is your only approach in UPSC reading comprehensions. Only approach, which is to say, go or work with a negative list of sorts. Or you can say, try to find reasons as to why each option should be wrong. This is what you have to go in. Do not go in thinking, oh, this is the right, and this looks right, therefore it should be in the options. No. Look for every option, think why it should be wrong, use that understanding to eliminate your options, condense your available choices, and then from the choices, you have to select the best answer. Why? Because every question is all about which is the most logical, most common, most critical message that is being conveyed. The word there is most. Most is a superlative sense, right? Which is to say, you have to compare various options. Some of these options may appear to be correct, right? You have to select the best one, right? This is what makes UPSC's reading comprehensions the most complicated, right? Now, in terms of what could be the best option or what could be the most logical answer to any question, right? This is where this is going to come in handy, right? Whether you understand as to why one option should be wrong, that option for which you have the least number of reasons, right? Or even no reason for that matter for you to mark them wrong, they should be the correct answer. Right? That is the only approach that you have to work with, nothing else, right? Now, in terms of areas from which UPSC asks you reading comprehensions, the most common areas would be, one is political philosophy. This is one of their preferred options. Another is economic policy. And the third most common one is climate bol do, environment bol do, or biodiversity. These are the most common passages that you are going to find. Amongst these most common passages, the more difficult ones are related to political philosophy, followed by economic policy, and these are usually the easiest ones, right? Now we are going to navigate through the entire, you can say, paper 2019 first, and we'll understand how do we go about these questions. Let's start with 2019. This is set A, 2019. The first question that you're getting is one that of reading comprehensions, right? Why I brought the paper and not a slide is for you to also understand that questions will be scattered. It's not like you will find all reading comprehensions in one corner. right? So set A begins with a question on reading comprehension. Let's read this comprehension first, this passage first, right? Now, you would also notice as you go from 2019 onwards, in fact, if you go a little bit backwards, right, you will find that the passage's length has been gradually decreasing, right? It's not this which is more important or more confusing. This is the question is usually the more confusing part. Let's read the first one. This is about political philosophies, right? It says, political theorists have no doubt, just a moment. Political theorists no doubt have to take history of injustice, for example, untouchability, seriously. What is being conveyed is, whoever is a political theorist, they have to take the history, not injustice, they have to take the history of injustice seriously. The one word here, untouchability, is only being used as an example of one type of historical injustice. The concept of historical injustice takes note of a variety of historical wrongs. That means there are too many kinds of historical wrongs. The concept of historical justice takes note of this variety that continue into the present. Such historical wrongs which have been persisting, right, in some form or the other, and tend to resist repair. Right, which is to say historical injustices may be persistent, right? They may be persistent not in the sense that they may not be manifesting in the same forms as they used to previously. They may have taken newer forms, right? And some of them will also tend to resist repair, which is to say they are difficult to get over, difficult to solve. Two reasons might account for the resistance to repair. Behind this resistance to repair, there could be two reasons. One, not only are the roots of injustice buried deep in history, injustice itself constitutes economic structures of exploitation, ideologies of discrimination, and modes of representation. Right? This is only telling you that not only are the roots of injustice buried deep in history, which is to say they have been historical, they have been continuing for a lot of time. Not just this, but if you look at the structures, economic structures of exploitation, the ideologies of discrimination, and the modes of representation, injustice itself constitutes this structure, right? Here you will have to apply your common sense. He's trying to talk to you about three different types of injustices. One could be economic injustice. The another could be ideologies. For example, you'll have to think of an example quickly. Ideologies of discrimination, for example, could be patriarchy for that matter, right? Generally speaking, considering men superior to women. That's an ideology, right? That also discriminates against a specific gender. Then he talks about modes of representation. This is hinting at a political representation also, right? So he's telling you that there could be a variety of injustices. Two, the second reason is the category of historical injustice generally extends across a number of wrongs such as economic deprivation, social discrimination, and lack of recognition. It's the same thing, right? This category is complex, not only because of the overlap between a number of wrongs, but because one or the other wrong, generally discrimination, tends to acquire partial autonomy from others. This is borne out by the history of repair in India. Last May, he's trying to tell you, right, this category of historical wrongs is complicated. Why is it complicated? Not only because one or the other kind of injustice overlaps with the other, but one or the other kind of injustice may also acquire partial autonomy. What does it mean, partial autonomy? Right? It simply means that if you try to eradicate one evil, it's not like others are automatically going to be eradicated. They are connected, but they are not connected interdependent. You can say completely. There's not a complete overlap between two, which is to say, if you have an understanding of society, right, you will understand this last line itself, which is to say, for example, if you think of caste, right, caste as a base of discrimination. Now, caste ordinarily looks to you like it's a mode of social organization, but caste also has economic dimensions, caste also has political dimensions, right? Ordinarily, any upward movement in classes typically also eradicates caste-based discrimination to a certain extent, which is to say, in high-income societies, caste discrimination is not as prevalent or it's not as intense as it is in lower economic groups. So economic and social injustice are linked with each other, but not completely. Even in high income societies, you find that there are some elements of caste discrimination also, right? So some part of it is autonomous partially, and some part of it is also dependent, right? This is what the passage is all about. Remember, your understanding of general studies is only going to help you make sense of what the passage is. This understanding should not cloud your options here. The question has to be solved on the basis of what has been written here, not on the basis of what you know, right? Not that. Okay, now let's read this one. Let's read the question. What is the main idea? What is the main idea that we can infer from the passage? If you have to ask of yourself, what could be the main idea? Main idea ka matlab kya hoga? Right? Why do you think that the author has written this passage? If yes, the crux generally spoken of, right? If you had to resolve this entire passage down to a singular line, what is the author implying here, or why has he written this specific passage, right? Now, look at each options. First one says, untouchability in India has not been taken seriously by political theorists. He has only used the word seriously in a context, which is he's saying that theorists have to take the history of injustice seriously, right? And he gave you an example of one injustice, which was untouchability. Nowhere was he mentioning that his theorists in India are taking injustice like untouchability non-seriously. So this is not your option. This is a clear-cut case of elimination. This is straight up wrong. B, historical injustice is inevitable in any society and is always beyond repair. He said that they tend to resist repair, right? And he has also mentioned some kinds of historical wrongs that tend to persist, right? Not all historical wrongs will persist, and he has not said that they are completely different or so completely difficult for you to get over, right? He has used the word resistance to repair, not impossibility to repair, right? So that is your reason to mark this wrong, right? Is that always beyond repair? This is too extreme, right? C says, social discrimination and deprivation have their roots in bad economies. One of the possible reasons behind social discrimination and deprivation could be bad economies. So is this factually wrong? Not factually wrong, right? But you have to also acknowledge, right, if you have to think of any reason for you to mark this wrong, it could be that this line seems to make it look like they have their roots in bad economies and nothing else. Yes, that's the only reason, which is the case, right? So, but factually, is it incorrect? No, you can deduce this, that they have their roots in bad economies, but okay, let's look at D first. D says it is difficult, if not impossible, to repair every manifestation of historical injustice. Now, this is exactly what he's trying to tell you. That one, there are various kinds of historical injustices also. Some of them tend to, we can say, resist repair. Some of them tend to persist, right? This is a very complicated category. Why? Because there could be different forms. These forms overlap with each other and also acquire some partial autonomy over each other, right? The central idea here was trying to highlight the resistance to repair of these historical injustices, right? Not what their root is. This root makes them difficult to repair, if not impossible. See, he has also classified, if not impossible, right? Answer has to be D. You have to look at each option, think why each option should be wrong. The one for which you have the least number of reasons to mark it wrong should be the right one. The last one, you have no reason for you to mark it wrong, right? Move to the next one. I think there is a similar question here. On the basis of the above passage, following assumptions have been made. Now, a common mistake that people do here is, right, assumption, they would want to believe that assumptions have been made previously to writing this passage. That's not the case. Once you have written the passage, now the author is making certain few assumptions. So practically, assumptions are also inferences in that sense, right? Now, on the basis of your understanding, let's read, right, which of these assumptions are correct. Every time you get an option where you are given sort of a combination of various options, the best way to go about this would be for you to understand, right, which one of these is wrong. The one which is obviously wrong, use it to eliminate, condense your available choices down to a few, and then select the best answer. First one says, removal of economic discrimination leads to removal of social discrimination. He has said this, yes, there is a certain overlap, but also that there is a certain partial autonomy, right? That means that removal of one is not going to automatically lead to the removal of the other, right? If he had used the word partially, right, then it would have been correct, right? Here it seems like he's talking about one kind of discrimination, if removed, automatically means the other kind of discrimination will also be removed, right? Second one says, that means one only cannot be correct. Both 1 and 2 cannot be correct. Second is, democratic polity is the best way to repair historical wrongs. Now, has he spoken about polity? Right? Has he spoken about what form of government is the best form of government to repair historical wrongs? This is completely beyond the scope of the passage, right? Therefore, not even this. The correct answer should be neither 1 nor 2. right? That is how you go about them. Next one. Education plays a great transformatory role in life, particularly so in this rapidly changing and globalizing world. He's only highlighting to you the importance of education. Education plays a great transformatory role, right? It helps you transform. So most likely it's written in a certain positive connotation, right? And he also qualifies it by saying specifically in this rapidly changing and globalizing world. Universities are the custodians of intellectual capital and promoters of culture and specialized knowledge. Right? From education, he straight up jumps to universities. He calls universities the custodians of intellectual capital because this is where you find the most intellectual class, the academia, the students, right? Newer ideas coming in universities. This is what he's hinting at. And promoters of culture and also specialized knowledge. Two things. Culture is an activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and human feelings. He tries to define what culture is, right? According to him, culture is an activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and human feelings. A merely well-informed man is only a bore on God's earth, which is to say somebody who is not receptive to beauty, somebody who is not receptive to human feelings, somebody, right, who is just informed, right, is a bore on God's earth. Bore on God's earth is not related to boredom. Bore you can think of as a gadda, right? That is what he's trying to talk about. What we should aim at is producing men who possess both culture and expert knowledge. This is what he started by saying, that universities are the custodians of culture or promoters of culture and also specialized knowledge. He's saying men should not focus only on this. Men should also focus on cultural aspects too, right? Somebody who should possess both culture and expert knowledge. Remember, he is being recommendatory here. He's saying what we should aim at is doing this, right? Their expert knowledge will give them a firm ground to start from, and their culture will lead them as deep as philosophy and as high as art, right? Together, it will impart meaning to human existence. So according to the author, this passage is primarily about acquiring both things. One, specialized knowledge. Second, culture. And he tries to first define what culture is. Also, towards the end, tells you the importance of culture. Right? That is what he's hinting at. All right. On the basis of the above passage, following assumptions have been made. First, a society without well-educated people cannot be transformed into a modern society. Is this what he's hinting at? He has said that we should be aiming at those people who acquire both culture and expert knowledge. So he's basically trying to make a case for whether people should have both, right? This assumption says society without well-educated people cannot be transformed into a modern society. Will you mark this right or will you mark this wrong? Nowhere in the passage is he trying to talk about what are traditional societies, what are modern societies, what is the classification criteria of what a modern society is, right? That both things are important, right? Does not mean the societies cannot transform themselves. That is the first thing. Second reason why you should be looking at it, you can say a little more cynically, is this. What do you mean a modern society, right? Has he mentioned what a modern society is? He does not go there at all. Right? So that should be your reason to mark this as wrong. Second says, without acquiring culture, and a person's education is not complete. Right? This is something that he's hinting at. We should be aiming at men who possess not just expert knowledge, but also culture. Right? This is what he's aiming at. In the first instance, he tries to talk about societies cannot transform, right, into modern societies. He's trying to build a case positively for you to also include cultural elements in your education also. Nowhere has he hinted at, societies have not been able to transform. They have remained stuck in their past itself. They have not modernized themselves, right? He does not go there at all. So this is primarily beyond the scope of the passage. Second one is much more informed, right, by what the contents of the passage were. So first one should be wrong, second one should be right, answer should be 2 only, right? Which is why you have to be very, very careful here, right? In these questions, you have to be supremely alert, right? In your UPSC-based passages, every option looks like it's the correct option, right? So keep that in mind, and especially those people who are only relying on reading comprehensions, right? This is tough, difficult. Next, this is more geography or environment, biodiversity type related. This would be easier, right? See, It says soil in which nearly all our food grows. Firstly, he says nearly all our food, not all our food, right? Soil in which nearly all our food grows is a living resource that takes years to form, yet it can vanish in minutes. He's hinting at soil being a living resource, which is something which you can say is born, something which also goes transformation, eventually may also get dead, right? And in that soil context, primarily this should be hinting at fertility itself. This is something that you understand because you know geography, because you know some bit of environment and biodiversity, something like that, right? Each year, 75 billion tons of fertile soil is lost to erosion, right? He's hinting at how soil can vanish. Every year, 75 billion tons of fertile soil is lost to erosion. That is alarming, not just for food producers. Soil can trap huge quantities of carbon dioxide in the form of organic carbon and prevent it from escaping into the atmosphere. Very, very short passage. He only first hints at one, soil being a living resource, right? The author has written it in a manner, he's hinting or he is trying to tell you that this is a living resource and it can also vanish, right? So you need to understand there is some importance to this aspect, right? It's a living resource, it can vanish. Then he gives you a certain status update on soil vanishing, primarily because of erosion. Then he tells you, right, in the beginning, he also told you soil ka ek importance, which was for food production. Towards the end, he's hinting at not only is it important for food producers, but it has certain environmental aspects too, right? Sequestration boldo isko, carbon dioxide ka, which is some ecological importance also, right? This is what he's hinting at. Your basic understanding of geography and E&B is going to come in very handy for you to understand it. Not a lot of nuance here. Let's look at the question though, right? Passages will normally be very easy to pick, right? It will be the questions which are difficult. Look at the question. First one says, on the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made, which is say, now you have understood the passage, I am making a few assumptions, check which of these are right or wrong. So practically, they are also conclusion type questions only, right? First says, large-scale soil erosion is a major reason for widespread food insecurity in the world. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is the passage going somewhere about large-scale erosion is a major reason for widespread food insecurity? Has he told you that there is food security in the world? He said soil is a resource in which nearly all our food grows. And every year, some amount of soil erosion happens of fertile soil. He does not go into food insecurity. Whether there is food security, insecurity or not, he does not go there at all, right? So this goes beyond the scope of the passage itself. Every time you find a combination of these, you can say statements or options, right? Work with finding some option which is evidently wrong, use it to eliminate, right? Although some element here would be hinted that it is clearly linked to food security, maybe that will place a doubt in your head. Try to see if there is any other statement which is obviously wrong or not. Second one says, soil erosion is mainly anthropogenic. He has said every year we lose 75 million tons of fertile soil to erosion. He does not tell you what the causes of erosion are. And anthropogenic meaning kya hoga? Human induced, right? Clearly second is evidently wrong. So you use second to eliminate options. Wherever you find second, this goes, this goes, this goes. By elimination, the answer is 3 only, right? Every time you find a combination, work by finding something which is obviously wrong, use it to eliminate, come down to a few options and then pick from those options, right? This is how you go about these things. Try not to go in thinking why this should be wrong, right? Go in by thinking why this should be wrong. Find the one which is evidently wrong, reduce your choices and then mark.
Hello aspirants, ready to master the UPSC Prelims exams? Introducing Sandhan, the personalized test series from VisionIAS. Gain access to over 15,000 high-quality questions customized for your personal study needs. Choose between VisionIAS and UPSC previous year questions for your tests. Sharpen your time management with timed assessments under exam conditions. Get tailored feedback and recommendations from targeted improvement. Build your confidence through customized practice sessions. Take control of your preparation. Enroll in the Sandhan Personalized Test Series today.
Next one. Right, this is one of the easier ones though. Next is about inequality. He says inequality is visible even statistically measurable in many instances, but the economic power that drives it is invisible and not measurable. Right? He's trying to tell you that inequality is visible, which is say you can see inequality. Right? Your understanding would be very clear. You can see some people are really high income groups, some people are low income groups, poor. Right? Inequality is visible. It's also something which is felt. He says inequality is even statistically measurable, that you can put a number to inequality also. For example, your understanding of economics may tell you, is there any way you measure inequality? Like a Lorentz curve, you measure inequality. At least Lorentz curve is a visual representation of inequality. Gini coefficient is a number that you can assign with inequality. It is statistically measurable also in many instances. He's not saying in all instances, but it is statistically measurable. But the economic power that drives it, which is say one of the prime factors behind this inequality, right, that is invisible. He's hinting at economic power, which is something which drives this inequality. That aspect is invisible and also not measurable. Power is not measurable, right? He's saying. Like the force of gravity, power is the organizing principle of inequality, be it of income, wealth, gender, race, religion, and region, right? He goes away from only economic power. He says power is the organizing principle of inequality. Power across various aspects of life. First is economic power. This is power across interpersonal relations or gender relations. This is power with respect to race. This is power with respect to religion and also region. Right? Some regions are economically more powerful. Some regions have been culturally also hegemonic. Right? The difference between, you can say, the developed world and the least developed world, developing world, that is a regional inequality. Right? Race-based power, which is say whites over blacks primarily. Right? Gender, men over women. Right? He's saying power is the organizing principle of inequality. And this could be of various realms in life. Its effects are seen in a pervasive manner. The effects of power are seen in a pervasive manner in all spheres. But the ways in which economic power pulls and tilts visible economic variables remains invisibly obscure. Right? He's saying the effect of power, it is seen in a pervasive manner across all spheres. You see the manifestation thereof. You know that generally the society considers men to be superior over women. You clearly see in terms of America, for example, the whites in terms of wealth are far above the blacks per se. You see that, right? What you do not see is how economic power pulls and tilts these economic variables. Variables is something that you see, right? But the power that lies behind it, that is something that you cannot see, right? This is what he's hinting at. A nice passage, very short, does not take you a lot of time to read it. On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, economic power is the only reason behind the existence of inequality in a society. Right? Not the only. He's mentioned gender, he's mentioned race, he's mentioned region, he's mentioned income, wealth. Right? He's trying to talk about various kinds of power. Right? Should this be the option? You use 1 to eliminate. Answer should be 3 only, right? If you are too confused about this, look at some other thing. Second one says inequality of different kinds, income, wealth, etc. reinforces power. Third is economic power can be analyzed more through its effects than by other direct empirical methods. Second one says inequality of different kinds reinforces power. He's trying to talk about how power creates inequality, not the other way around. So you could use 2 also to eliminate, right? If you pick 2 से आप क्या eliminate कर सकते थे? First you could have eliminated, this you could have eliminated. Then you would have had a choice between 3 and 1 and 3 only, which is to say 3 is correct, right? You have to pick whether 1 is correct or not, right? And 1 is visibly incorrect. Remember, do not go in thinking which is the right answer, right? Pick the wrong one, use it to eliminate. And that is going to make your life so much more easier. Let's see the next one. Climate change. See, this is an interesting passage. He says, climate change may actually benefit some plants by lengthening growing seasons and increasing carbon dioxide. Ordinarily, every time you read about climate change, you read about it in a more negative connotation, in terms of its harmful consequences, not in terms of its positive consequences. Here, you have to pick the tone of the passage. He straight up talks to you about climate change may actually be benefiting some plants by lengthening what? Their growing seasons and by increasing carbon dioxide. Right? Which is to say some plants may benefit if climate change lengthens their, for example, summer-based plants. Or climate change का मतलब ये नहीं कि सिर्फ it's only going to be warming. In some regions, it could be even extended periods of cold. Right? So that may benefit some kind of plants. Right? By what? By lengthening growing seasons and increasing carbon dioxide. Yet, other effects of a warmer world, such as more pests, droughts, and flooding, will be less benign, right? He's saying, yes, climate change may be benefiting some plants by doing these two things, yet, right? Every time we find yet, but, however, this is where the author is going to go contrarian, right? Yet, other effects of warmer world will be less benign. Benign ka matlab kya hota hai? There are two types of tumors. One is called malignant, the other is called benign. Benign is harmless, right? You would say harmless. It's not, you would not say it's positive, right? You would say it's less harmful, right? That's how benign is used, right? Which is say climate change may be beneficial, but there are other effects of climate change which could be harmful, right? Less benign, he's saying. How will the world adapt, right? How will the world adapt to climate change? Researchers project by 2050, suitable croplands for 4 commodities, maize, potatoes, rice, and wheat will shift. In some cases, pushing farmers to plant new crops, right? Some farmlands may benefit from warming, but others won't. Climate alone does not dictate yields. Alone does not dictate yields. Political shifts, global demand, agricultural practices will influence how farms fare in the future, right? Now, what is he hinting at? First, he is not overcritical about climate change, right? He's also highlighting that climate change may benefit some plants, but he's also not extremely positive about climate change either. He also highlights that there are certain negative aspects of climate change too, right? Then he tries to go into how will the world adapt to this climate change. Then he talks about some farmlands, right? Some farmers may be pushed to produce new crops because the conditions would have changed, that this will not support the existing crops. They're going to change or plant new crops. Some farmlands may benefit from warming, some farmlands may not. Then he tries to talk about it's not just climate that dictates yields of these plants. Other factors, for example, political shifts, global demand, agricultural practices, this also influences how farms fare in the future, right? Let's read the question now. Look at the question. The question says, which of the following is the most logical and rational inference? See, the most logical and rational, which is to say some inferences here could be logical and could be rational. You have to pick the best one amongst them, which is why read every option, compare each option with the other. First one says, farmers who modernize their methods and diversify their fields will be in an advantageous position in the future, right? Is this wrong? He's saying climate change may harm some farmlands, right? Some farmers may have to practice newer things, right? He also towards the end talks about how farm practices also influence, right, what is going to happen to the yields. So evidently this is not a wrong statement to say, right? They are going to be beneficial, those who adapt to the changing conditions, right? B says, climate change will adversely affect crop diversity, right? Has he said that it's going to affect crop diversity, right? He said it is going to benefit some, right? And some may even reduce, right? So net impact, you don't know, right? Diversity is only in terms of numbers, right? It's not in terms of volume of each, right? It's only in terms of how many different varieties there are, right? There are chances that some varieties which are not existent right now may even shoot up, right? That can also happen. Nowhere can you evidently make a net impact, right? Net impact, you don't know whether it will be adverse only, right? Will adversely affect, you cannot say. So there is that reason for you to mark it wrong, right? Because he is too certain that it is definitely going to negatively impact crop diversity, right? C says, shifting major crops to new croplands will lead to great increase in the total area under cultivation and thus an increase in the overall agricultural production, right? Why is this wrong, right? Some farmers may be induced to shift to newer farmlands. That can also happen. For example, in a certain case, if the climate changes to an extent that the existing crops are not being favored by the change in the climate, right? You will have to crop these or plant these crops in newer areas where the climate is more favorable. Whether that is going to lead to an increase in the total area under cultivation, you can't say, right? You cannot say what the net impact would be. It may even lead to a reduction in the total area. It may lead to the total area being the same, or it could also be a possibility that the total area under cultivation increases, right? It could be that the existing croplands are rendered just useless. That can also happen, right? So net impact you cannot say, right? Therefore, this wrong. D says climate change is the most important factor affecting agricultural economy in the future. He's clearly not tried to write it in a comparative sense. He's only hinting that climate change is not the only factor, right? Whether it's the most important factor, you would have said this if the passage was trying to compare climate change with the effects of others also. So it's saying most important, you cannot make that conclusion because the passage has not been written in a comparative sense, right? Therefore, by elimination, option has to be A, right? This is how you have to go about it. Next is more interesting. It's about science. A bat's wings may look like sheets of skin, but underneath, a bat has the same 5 fingers as an orangutan or a human, right? As well as a wrist connected to the same cluster of wrist bones, connected to the same long bones of the arm, right? He's trying to tell you, although visibly a bat's wings look different, but if you look at the underlying structure is similar to orangutans or even humans, right? What can be more curious than that the hand of a man formed for grasping, that of a mole for digging, the leg of the horse, the paddle of a porpoise, and the wing of a bat should all be constructed on the same pattern, right? He's saying it is so curious, or it's so interesting that limbs of various kinds of species, animal species, right, they're constructed on the same pattern, although now they have evolved, right? Now the question here he's asking you is, which of the following is the most logical, scientific, and rational inference, right? The word here is also scientific, right? Which is to say there should be some reason, scientific reason behind marking any of these options. First one says, different species having similar structure of hands is an example of biodiversity, right? Different species is an example of biodiversity. Similar structure of hand is not an example of biodiversity, right? You only, for biodiversity, it just means different species. That's about it. Similarities are not pointed out when you talk about diversity, right? So this thing, having similar structure of hands, is not pointing at diversity actually. B is, limbs used by different species for different kinds of work is an example of biodiversity. Once again, that's not how biodiversity is defined. Biodiversity is just, you can say, a diversity in terms of number of species of flora and fauna. That's it, right? Not how they use their limbs. C is, man and the aforementioned animals having similar structure of hands is an example of coincidence in evolution. Now, it is an example of evolution, surely, but is it an example of coincidence? Is it just a matter of sanyog? Ki aisa hua hoga, right? That does not make it scientific, right? That's the reason you have to mark it at wrong. But you have to compare. The last one has to be, last one says, man and the aforementioned animals have shared an evolutionary history. This is the reason why the underlying structure is the same, although the visible manifestations are different, right? If you have to pick between C and D, answer should be D. When you say coincidence in evolution, that means that you are not trying to explore what the reason could be. That's not scientific, right? The more scientific answer is D. You see, these are such interesting passages that the UPSC asks, right? And more interesting other questions around it. Very interesting passage, this one also. Chalo, itna karte hain. Okay. Around 56 million years ago, the Atlantic Ocean had not fully opened, right? 56 million years pehle, Atlantic Ocean had not fully opened, and animals, perhaps including our primate ancestors, could walk from Asia to North America through Europe and across Greenland, probably hinting at Pangaea, right? Mostly hinting at that. Earth was warmer than it is today. Now this is surprising, right? You would assume that Earth would have been colder. He's saying Earth was warmer than it is today. But as the Paleocene epoch gave way to Eocene, it was about to get much warmer still. So it was warmer than what you find today. It was about to get even more warmer, right? From Paleocene as we move towards Eocene. Rapidly and radically. Not just, it is not going to get warmer, it's going to get warmer rapidly and also radically warmer, right? The cause was a massive geologically sudden release of carbon. Geologically would be something related to Earth, right? Some release of carbon happened, that was the cause. Sudden release of carbon. During this period, called Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, PETM, carbon injected into the atmosphere was roughly the amount that would be injected today if humans burned all the Earth's reserves of coal, oil, and natural gas. Which is a huge, we can say, amount of carbon dioxide was injected into the atmosphere in this thermal event, right? So much more than if you can combine all your fossil fuels, right? However much carbon you're going to release in the atmosphere, that is the amount which was released around here. The PETM lasted for about 150,000 years. until excess carbon was reabsorbed, right? So this period lasted for about 150,000 years, which is a considerable long time, right? And eventually this excess carbon was reabsorbed. It brought on drought, floods, insect plagues, and a few extinctions. Life on Earth survived. Indeed, it prospered, but it was drastically different, right? So it is more in terms of evolutionary history of the planet, generally speaking, climate history, right? Question. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made, right? Once again, because you're getting a combination here, try to find one which is evidently wrong. So evidently wrong hai, use it to eliminate. First one says global warming has a bearing on planet's biological evolution. Yes, he has clearly said life on Earth survived, but it was drastically different. So in terms of evolution of life, climate change will of course have an impact. Not evidently wrong. You cannot use it to eliminate. Second one says separation of land masses causes the release of huge quantities of carbon into the atmosphere. Right? He has only said there was a certain geological release of carbon. He did not tell you how. Right? Which is to say that release of carbon was related to Earth, right? He's not pointing out whether it was caused when the continents separated, right? So this is your reason to mark it as wrong. 2 has to be wrong. Use 2 to eliminate. This goes, this goes. Now you have a choice between B and C. 3 and 4, 1 and 3. That means 3 is evidently correct. You have to check 4. 1 we have seen, 1 is not evidently wrong. Let's see 4. 4 says, the present man-made global warming will finally lead to conditions similar to those what happened 56 million years ago. This is more, you can say he's being predictive here. The passage does not go into what is going to happen in the future at all. So 4 is also evidently wrong. Answer clearly should therefore be 1 and 3. Right? That is how you go about them. Right? If you get too stuck into what assumptions mean, this and that, then you're not going to come down to the right answer. Right? Always go in with a negative approach here. Next passage is this one. Internet of Things. He says, low-end Internet of Things devices are cheap commodity items. Addressing security would add to the cost. He's saying, the low-end IoT things, devices, they are cheap commodity items. For example, you may think of, and Alexa is not cheap, although you will see bulbs right now. Right? There are smart switches also. Yes, switches also, plugs also. These are IoT, right? IoT devices. He's saying these are cheap commodities. Therefore, addressing their security is going to add to the cost, right? This class of items is proliferating with new applications. Many home appliances, thermostats, security and monitoring devices, and personal convenience devices are part of the IoT, which is say the number is growing, right? So are fitness trackers. Certainly, certain medical implants and computer-like devices in automobiles. The IoT is expected to expand exponentially, but new security challenges are daunting, right? First, he's trying to tell you that IoT, which is the Internet of Things, you need to know what IoT is. IoT devices, right? There are some some low-end IoT devices also. Right? These are cheap commodities. Therefore, if you want to address their security, it is going to add to the cost of production in general. Then he tries to tell you that IoT devices have been increasing exponentially. Therefore, because low-end IoT devices could be prone to security challenges, therefore, addressing them would become a daunting task in the future. That is what he is pointing at. This is more projection, like this is more predictive what is going to happen in the future. Right? Question says, which of the following is the most logical and rational inferences? First one says, development of enabling technologies in India can be a big boost to the manufacturing sector. Firstly, not related to India. Secondly, we don't know how many, we don't know what India's existing manufacturing structure is on the basis of the passage itself, right? That is not what you want to select, right? Makes it India specific. You do not know what the status of manufacturing sector right now is. You do not know how big an industry this is going to be. Although it's clearly going to expand, we don't know what in terms of total trade. We don't know that, right? We cannot make that comparison. B says, India is not yet fully ready to adopt IoT in view of imminent security challenges. Once again, the passage is not India-centric. Whether India is ready or not, the passage does not go there at all. So this is your reason to mark this as wrong. C says, life becomes more comfortable with the development of cheap, low-end IoT devices. Now, of course, he's mentioned that some low-end IoT devices are cheap commodities, right? He's not trying to tell you how that makes your life more convenient, right? This is an assumption that you can make on your own, but the passage is not hinting at that. The passage is only trying to tell you that there could be security concerns with respect to that, right? Not this. D says, as we go digital, we must recognize the huge threat to internet security from some IoT devices. Clearly, this is what he's hinting at, right? Easy? Let's move to the next one. While the digital phenomenon restructuring most social sectors, while the digital phenomenon restructuring most social sectors, it is little surprise that global trade negotiations are now eyeing the digital area in an attempt to preemptively colonize it. Right? He's basically trying to tell you that digitalization is restructuring most social sectors, which is to say the influence of digitalization is now being extended to social sectors also. It is a little surprise that it does not surprise us that global trade negotiations are now eyeing the digital area in an attempt to preemptively colonize it. Right? It's like a first mover advantage. Big data is freely collected. This is freely collected or mined from developing countries and converted into digital intelligence in the developed countries. This intelligence begins to control different sectors and extract monopoly rents. A large foreign company providing cab service, for instance, is not a network of cars and drivers. It's digital intelligence about commuting, public transport, roads, traffic, city events, personal behavioral characteristics of commuters and drivers, and so on. Right? Here you have to use your commonsensical knowledge. For example, this example you can apply to Uber, right? What he's trying to tell you is, one, digitalization is expanding. Digitalization is also now extending its influence to certain social sectors, right? Now, because digitalization is growing, quite obviously you would see certain players wanting to preempt that this is going to happen, this is going to expand. They want to, you can say, hijack, or they want to colonize trade negotiations therein, right? They want to come to a position of advantage to begin with, right? Then he tells you about big data. Big data is collected from developing countries. It is converted into actionable intelligence in developed countries, and that actionable intelligence then begins to control different sectors and extract monopoly rents, right? For example, Uber. What is a monopoly rent if you think of? Monopoly rent क्या होता है? Yes, you become too big. You become so big that you create entry barriers for other competitors also. If you have read common books, for example, from 0 to 1 PTTL books, you would understand what this basically means, right? Monopoly rents ka matlab kya hai? First, you make sure that there is absolutely no competition in the sector alone, right? And when there is no competition, then you can focus on getting your price advantage, right? A large foreign company providing cab service is, for instance, not a network of cars and drivers anymore. Right? Uber does not have any of its own fleet. Right? How does then Uber operate? Uber connects prospective clients with drivers. Right? They know about your patterns also. Right? They know about the public transport in the situation because there are maps already. They also know about city events. They also know about personal behavior characteristics of commuters. If you have ever interacted with the Uber driver, he will show you the map. The map also always show you the hot spots in the city, right? Which is the area from which the most demand is coming in right now. So that is actionable intelligence with a company which does not even own its fleet, right? Look at the question. Question now asks you, which of the following is the most logical and rational corollary to the above passage? Now here you need to understand what the meaning of the word corollary is. Corollary ka matlab kya hai? Using the above passage, you will come down to one conclusion. On the basis of the conclusion, you can make another conclusion. That is going to be corollary itself. First one says, globalization is not in the interests of India as it undermines its socio-economic structure, right? Is he hinting at that globalization is not in the interest of India? Firstly, the passage is not about India, right? Secondly, the passage is not telling you that it's not in the interest of India. He's only trying to tell you what major countries are doing. They're trying to preemptively colonize this. So he's trying to make you aware of it. He's not telling you globalization is bad, right? So not this. B says, India should be careful to protect its digital sovereignty in global trade talks, right? Now, once again, each of these sentences is all about India, right? So that means you will have to presume or you will have to apply this to India itself, right? So India alone could not be a reason to say ki nahi, this option is wrong. First one is only trying to tell you it's not in the interests of India as it undermines its social economic structures. Second one says India should be careful to protect its digital sovereignty in global trade talks. Right? It is not evidently wrong. He's trying to tell you that developed countries, which mines data freely from developing countries, converts it into actionable intelligence, then uses it to control various sectors. So you should be more careful. Right? He's not telling you exactly what to do. He's only telling you should be careful of this. Right? So not so wrong. C says India should charge monopoly rents from multinational companies in exchange for big data. Now this is being recommendatory, right? He's trying to tell you what the solution there is, right? Should it be extracting monopoly rents? If you have a basic understanding of economics, you would understand monopoly rents are something that eventually lead to a loss of innovation in any sector. Right? If you have not enough competition, competition fosters variety. It fosters an improvement in quality. It also fosters a decrease in prices for the consumers also. Monopoly rents are generally bad, right? He's not saying, what he's trying to say is some companies first acquire so much intelligence that they monopolize the sector and then they start charging monopoly rents. If you have a basic understanding of economy, you will understand that monopoly rents are fundamentally bad. He will not be recommending that India should be charging this monopoly rent. This does not happen, right? Should be wrong. D says the loss of big data from India is proportional to the degree or value of its foreign trade, right? Firstly, there's no loss of big data, right? Big data is being extracted and actionable intelligence is being developed out of it, right? There is no such thing as the loss of big data. Secondly, we do not know how much of this loss, if you may want to call it that, happens, right? Is it proportional to the degree of or value of its foreign trade or not, right? Between each of these, the answer should be 20 should be B. For example, think of it mathematically only. Na? जैसे corollary का मतलब क्या होगा? If you have a right angle triangle, hypotenuse का square is the sum of squares of the other two sides. Or if in a triangle, you have one side whose square is the sum of the other two sides, then it's a right angle triangle, right? You're using the same conclusion to draw another conclusion. That is a corollary, right? So on the basis of this passage, you're making one conclusion. On the basis of that conclusion, can you make another conclusion or not? That is what a corollary is. If you get two stuck here, right, that is then going to confuse you. Do not go into the semantics of these words. Just try to understand why should one option be wrong, right? The least number of reasons for any option, that should be your correct answer. 23 says, which of the following is most definitively implied by the passage? Once again, most definitively implied by the passage. You can't see it, just a moment. First one says, big data is the key resource in the digital space, right? Is he saying, is this wrong, that big data is the key resource in the digital space? It's not completely wrong either. It is a key resource, right? Countries are extracting big data, driving actionable intelligence out of it. It is a key resource. He's not saying it's the most important resource. He's saying it's an important resource. That's about it. So does not look very wrong, right? B says, big economies create big data. No, he says big economies are even extracting big data from developing economies also. So it's not like they are creating big data. They are creating actionable intelligence out of this big data. So this is wrong. C says, access to big data is the prerogative of developed countries. Access to big data, as in, like whether you have access to this data which is generated, it is the prerogative of developed countries. No, it's not the prerogative of developed countries. This data belongs to you, right? Other companies or countries are using your data and making intelligence out of it, right? So it's not the prerogative of those developed countries. At the end of the day, your sovereignty lies with you, your digital sovereignty. What has to be done to your data is eventually going to be in your power only, right? Not this. D says access to and possession of big data is a characteristic of developed countries. Once again, access to and possession of big data. Data is being generated by developing countries. Big data is just a lot of data that is being generated because people have started to use digital devices or connected devices, right? You will also have access to this data. You will also possess this data. It's just that developed countries are using this access and using this data to convert it into actionable intelligence. That's the only thing. Answer should be A, right? Get it? Next is the rural poor across the world, including India, have contributed little to human-induced climate change. Right? He's saying across the world, of course, including India, rural poor have had a little contribution when it comes to not climate change, when it comes to human-induced climate change. They have contributed little. Yet, they are on the front line in coping with its effects, which is to say, its effects disproportionately affect the poorer sections. Right? Farmers can no longer rely on historical averages for rainfall and temperature and the more frequent and extreme weather events such as droughts, floods that can spell disaster. Right? Which is to say, right now, because climate change is happening so spontaneously or maybe randomly, that farmers cannot anymore rely on historical averages of rainfall. Anything can happen, right, this year. So there is no predictability when it comes to it. Second is that more frequent and extreme weather events, right? These extreme weather events are more frequent also now. They can spell disasters. And there are newer threats, such as sea level rise, impact of melting glaciers on water supply. How significant are small farms? As many as 2 billion people worldwide depend on them for their food and livelihood requirements. Some smallholder farmers in India produce 41% of the country's food grains and other food items that contribute to local and national food security. So he's trying to only talk to you about climate change and its impacts on small farmers or rural poor. Begins with rural poor, then tries to go into small farmers. Yes. And their contribution thereof. Importance of small farmers. Question is, which of the following is the most logical and rational corollary to the above passage? Right? Now, if you get too stuck into the corollary of the passage, then you'll have to first think of a conclusion, and then on the basis of that conclusion, don't go there. Just evaluate these options. First one says, supporting small farmers is an important agenda of is an important part of any agenda regarding environmentally sustainable development. Is it wrong, evidently? It does not look like it's evidently wrong, right? It can have a huge impact on small farmers, and small farmers are important for food security. So therefore, any effort at environmentally sustainable development should support small farmers. So it's not evidently wrong. B says, poor countries have little role to play in the mitigation of global warming. Right? He's not said poor countries have a little role to play in their mitigation. Quite obviously, when climate change is going to impact them disproportionately, they should have some role to play. Right? So not this. And also he's not going into the governance aspects as yet. C is, due to a large number of farmer households, India will not have food security problem in the foreseeable future. He says small farmers in India produce roughly around 41% of your food requirements. And climate change is going to disproportionately impact the rural poor in India. Quite obviously, that is going to create small farmers, right? That means due to a large number of farmer households. Firstly, he has only spoken of the contribution of small farmers when it comes to food security. He does not tell you what is the total proportion of farmer households in India. So, you cannot from the passage establish this. Right? There is a large number of farmer households in India. He's only said small farmers contribute 41%. That's about it. How many small farmers, how many big farmers? He does not go there at all. Right? So not this. D says only smallholder farmers in India can ensure food security. Now, smallholder farmers contribute 41%. They are important when it comes to food security, but it does not mean that only smallholder farmers in India contribute to food security. Right? Answer therefore has to be A. Easy. Next is the above passage implies that. First, there is a potential problem of food insecurity in India. Remember, he's saying potential problem. Because small farmers contribute to 41% of your total food requirements, and climate change has gotten more frequent. There are more extreme weather events that are happening, right? You cannot anymore rely on historical averages, right? That is what can create a potential problem. He's not saying it's going to create a problem, he's saying a potential problem. So not evidently wrong. 2 says India will have to strengthen its disaster management capabilities. Right? It is implying that these events have gotten much more frequent. Therefore, you should focus on strengthening your disaster management capabilities also. Both of them you don't have a reason for you to mark them as wrong. Therefore, it should be both 1 and 2. Right? Once again, climate. I told you climate is one of their favorite areas, and climate-based questions are usually easier. Okay. A changing climate and eventual efforts of the governments, however reluctant to deal with it, could have a big impact on the investors' returns. He's saying changing climate and the eventual efforts of the government. Once the climate changes, right, when the government starts to make certain efforts. Clearly, he has said, however reluctant, that governments may not be wanting to make these efforts, right? But whatever efforts they make, that is going to have a big impact on what? On investors' returns, right? Not just dividends, returns, it could be anything, right? Companies that produce or use large amounts of fossil fuels will face higher taxes and regulatory burdens, right? This could be one of the efforts of the governments eventually, that those companies which use or produce large amounts of fossil fuels, they will face higher taxation and regulatory burdens. Some energy producers may find it impossible to exploit their known reserves and be left with what you call stranded assets. Some energy producers may find it impossible to exploit their known reserves when countries become a little too stringent about the use of fossil fuels, right? You may have certain energy producers who have assets, right? These assets, but now could not be used anymore, primarily because it may be contributing to climate change. Therefore, they will be left with what you call stranded assets. Assets, they are your assets, you can expect a certain return on it, but you cannot use them. Primarily hinting at that countries or governments may be forcing you to not use them, right? Stranded assets, deposits of oil and coal that have to be left in the ground. Other industries could be affected by the economic damage caused by more extreme weather, storms, floods, heat waves, and droughts, right? Simple passage. Okay, let's read the questions now. He says, on the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First is, governments and companies need to be adequately prepared to face the climate change. Is this wrong? Not wrong at all, right? There's no reason for you to be marking this wrong, right? Climate change hoga, so governments and companies need to be adequately prepared, right? Because it's a combination-based question, find out the one which is evidently wrong. Second one says, extreme weather events will reduce economic growth of governments and companies in the future. Third one says, ignoring climate change is a huge risk for investors, right? Is there any statement which is wrong? Once again, ignoring climate change is a huge risk for investors. He's trying to tell you that climate change is going to pose a risk to investors' returns. Right? If you are not aware of what climate change can do, right, some companies may even have stranded assets in the future. So if you are not ignoring it, then there is a risk to your returns too. Right? Not evidently wrong. Second, once again, this will reduce the economic growth of governments and companies in the future. Once again, yes, if you pick, see, this is one of those passages which most people are going to get wrong. Why? Because if you read this passage, the passage first gives you a hint. Efforts of the government, however, reluctant to deal with it, which is say governments ordinarily would not want to come to extreme steps. वो ऐसे already नहीं आएंगे. Right? For example, if you have to migrate from fossil fuel based to, let's say, natural gas based. If you were worried about pollution, so you wanted people to move from, let's say, petrol to CNG. Right? Right now, you are telling people to migrate to electric mobility. Governments are not going to start or not going to give you, you can say, start going to ban certain sectors left, right, and center unless they have alternatives. Right? And he's trying to talk about economic growth of governments in general. Right? Remember, economic growth will be a combined effect of all sectors. Some companies, right, who are dependent on fossil fuels, either use them too much or produce too much, right? Some companies definitely will face, you can say, probably could face, you can say, a negative growth or a reduction in their profits. But some companies will also, some sectors also become sunrise sectors, right? In the availability of options only is the government then going to, you can say, allow certain companies to use fossil fuels or even calibrate that use, right? Is it definitely going to affect economic growth? We cannot say. It may not, right? Economic growth is country-wide. That means it is going to be all sectors included, right? It could be that amongst the 10 sectors, 3 of those sectors have started to witness negative growth. That does not mean economic growth is not going to happen, right? Collectively, other sectors may even grow for that matter. That is the reason why 2 has to be marked as wrong. He says will reduce the economic growth. If he had used the word may reduce the economic growth, here you would have been, that could be possible. Because he's saying will, right? Will, must, they indicate some element of certainty to it, right? It's not necessary that there will be a reduction in economic growth. Why? Because economic growth is countrywide, across all sectors. Not every sector is fossil fuel dependent. Secondly, there could be certain sectors which may appear as alternatives to these conventional fuels, right? Yes, like LPG to solar. Solar sector may grow. Electric mobility can grow, even as petrol and you can say internal combustion engine based automobiles, they may decline, right? So you cannot be sure that economic growth has to reduce. Use 2 to eliminate. This goes, this goes. Now you have a choice between 3 only and 1 and 3 only. That means 3 is correct. Ignoring climate change is a huge risk. He's saying it's a risk for investors, right? He's not saying that this is going to actually lead to your losses. It's a risk. First one says governments and companies need to be adequately prepared. Yes, of course. Therefore, 1 and 3. Okay? This is something that most aspirants are going to go wrong. Also, because right now we are discussing it here, right? In the exam, there's very limited time, right? In that limited time, picking on this nuance, right? That could be tricky. Which is why I tell you that even if you may be really good at reading comprehensions, chances are that you're going to get 2 to 3 odd wrong, right? Because of these problems. Next is access to schooling for those coming off school age is close to universal, but access to quality exhibits a sharp gradient with socioeconomic status. What he's saying is, in terms of just mere access to schools, which is to say, schools are available in your region and you can access and you can physically go and reach these schools, right? That is not a problem anymore, right? Access to schooling for those is close to universal, which is to say almost everyone has schools available now and they access these schools, but the access to quality education, that exhibits a sharp gradient with economic status. Gradient ka matlab kya? Right, for some socio-economic strata, right, quality education would be high. For some economic strata, access to quality education would be lesser. Right? It is not to say that quality is a problem overall. Quality could be a problem for certain socio-economic strata. Right? Quotas for the weaker sections in private schools is a provision introduced by the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act. So quotas for weaker sections in private schools. Right? This was a provision introduced by the RTE Act 2009. The quotas have imposed a debate. Debate on what? A debate on issues of social integration and equity in education that private actors had escaped by and large. The fact that there is an act, this act proposes quota for weaker sections even in private schools, that has started a debate. A debate, one, on the issues of social integration. Integration ka meaning kya? Right, you may have a school which is, let's say, a fancy school like a Sanskriti school. Right? Now, ordinarily, children of politicians, children of bureaucrats, children of businessmen go to this school. Now, because the government has proposed a quota for economically weaker sections, in the same class, you will have very rich kids, and in the same class, you will have very poor kids. Right? How do the poor people integrate with the richer people? Right? That also will have real consequences in terms of learning outcomes. Right? If you cannot integrate with the rest of the class, you are always feeling this ostracization. Sometimes this ostracization is also evident. Sometimes the teachers make it evidently clear also. Right? That is a problem, right? When this social integration does not happen, when you are made aware of where you stand in the socio-economic ladder, right? That is going to definitely affect your learning outcomes. He's not telling you although what the impact is, he's saying it's led to a debate on social integration. Then, and he does not take sides, he's not taking any sides here. Then he says, and of equity in education that private actors had escaped by and large. Equity in education ka meaning kya hoga? Stake, you can say, in the education sector. Like, because in India, education is both public and private. Up until now, right, private educators or private players had escaped this equity wala aspect. Right? The idea of an egalitarian education system with equality of opportunity as its primary goal appears to be outside the space that private school principles inhabit. He's saying the idea of an egalitarian, more equal education system with equality of opportunity, right? Opportunity in terms of access to these schools, right? As a primary goal appears to be outside the space that private school principles inhabit. Therefore, the imposition of quotas has led to resistance, sometimes justified, right? which is say, should it be the responsibility of private players, right, who have, you can say, invested in setting up these institutions to ensure that there is equality of opportunity, right? And towards the end, he's saying sometimes this is justified, right? So you have to pick the tone of the author here also. He's not being overtly critical, right, that private players, they should definitely impose these quotas. He's also siding by them, although not evidently, bahut zyada bhi nahi, but he's hinting at that yes, sometimes it's also justified, this resistance, right? Question is, with reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, making equality of opportunity a reality is the fundamental goal of the Indian education system, right? Making equality of opportunity a reality is the fundamental goal of the Indian education system. Second is, it does not tell you so much. Let's read all of these three because, of course, this is a combination-based question. Second is, the present Indian school system is unable to provide egalitarian education, right? Third is, abolition of private schools and establishment of more government schools is the only way to ensure egalitarian education, right? Which of these is evidently wrong? 3 is evidently wrong, right? You use 3 to eliminate. Now you are down to 1 and 2 only and 2 only, right? Second one says the present Indian school system is unable to provide egalitarian education, right? It has to be correct, right? Because now the choices are between 1 and 2 and 2 only. You have to check whether 1 is correct or not. Tell me. It's a goal but not a? Making equality of opportunity a reality is the fundamental goal of the Indian education system, right? A fundamental goal bol raha hai, right? One of the primary goals of the Indian. It's not, this word is not so much important, right? Should it be correct? Should it not be correct? Should be correct? Like, once again, he's talking about the Indian education system, right? In the passage, he talks about education system has private players also, right? This is where he was trying to talk about now. These private operators, they exist in a realm, right, which basically had been escaping this. The idea of egalitarian education system with equality of opportunity as its primary goal appears to be outside the space that private school principals inhabit, right? Which is to say, should it be the responsibility of private schools also to establish equality of opportunity? Right? This is what he's trying to hint at. This option, if you select this option, you are saying it is the ultimate goal of the Indian education system to provide equality of opportunity. The Indian education system has both public and private schools. Do you think equality of opportunity is the ultimate goal of private schools also? In fact, he towards the end says sometimes justified, right? One of the reasons could be integration. The second reason is somebody who has set up a private school is not doing a service, right? There is money invested and the person also wants certain profits on it, right? Why should it be his realm that there should be equality of opportunity to everyone, right? The government is one aspect, private schools are another aspect. And towards the end, because he said sometimes justified, right? So he's not taking an overtly critical tone that this should also be imposed on them, right? This part, when he says Indian education system, is the one thing that has to be used, right? First is wrong, right? Why? Because in the Indian education system, there are also private schools. It's not their primary goal to ensure equality of opportunity, right? So for answer has to be 2 only. This is one passage which most people would have gotten wrong, right? Most of them. And some of them may have used the wrong formula and gotten the right answer, thinking that this is the fundamental goal. Upar likha hua primary goal. It's practically the same thing, right? These are very, very interesting passages that they ask. A majority of TB infected in India are poor and lack sufficient nutrition. Majority of TB infected are poor, they lack sufficient nutrition, suitable housing, and have little understanding of its prevention. TB then devastates families, makes the poor poorer, particularly affects women and children, leads to ostracization and loss of employment. Then he's trying to talk to you about when you get TB, what is it that it does to you, right? First, he tries to talk to you about that it devastates families, makes the poor poorer. Why would it make the poor poorer? Right? There is a direct and an indirect cost to TB. Direct would be the amount of money that you have to spend on its cure. right? Indirect would be the loss of work or loss of days that you could go to employment. That is one. It could make the poor poorer. It particularly affects women and children. Why? Because most of them are poor. In the poorer households, typically the primary breadwinner has to be the male, right? If the male typically gets affected, right, or it is a greater chance of affecting the household income. Usually, it is the women and children who are going to suffer more. Why? Because they are dependent on the males. Third, he says, leads to ostracization. Ostracization ka matlab kya? Pushing you towards the fringes. It possibly could also be because of the fact that TB is contagious. There are two types of TB, pulmonary and extrapulmonary. Extrapulmonary is not contagious, but pulmonary is contagious. That could lead to ostracization, right? There were previously, what are these called? Sanatoriums. If you remember this, just Nehru's wife, Pradhan Mantri Nehru's wife, Kamala Nehru, was sent to a sanatorium, right? Why? Because back in the day, it's also called death by consumption. And if you have heard of this term, death by consumption, in your history books also, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere has it written, one emperor died of consumption. That is tuberculosis, right? Because it was very, very contagious, right? So you were sent to sanatoriums also, right? In the hills, right? At a secluded area where chances of you infecting other people is lesser. That could be the reason for ostracization. Another reason for ostracization could also be because it makes the poor poorer, then these people are going to be dependent on others and other people are then going to shrug them off. That also could be one of the reasons. And loss of employment is understandable. The truth is that even if TB does not kill them, hunger and poverty will. Which is say TB may not kill you as a disease, but the hunger that it induces or the poverty that it induces, that may kill you. Right? Another truth is that deep-seated stigma, lack of counseling, expensive treatment, lack of adequate support from providers and family, coupled with torturous side effects, demotivate patients to continue treatment with disastrous health consequences. Right? Deep-seated stigma usually with TB is because TB is generally considered a poor man's disease. Right? That could be this. Right? There is deep-seated stigma. There is also lack of counseling. The treatment is expensive. Lack of adequate support from providers and family, coupled with side effects of these, because they are usually high-dose antibiotics also. This is called the DOTS program, if you know this. Right? If you go to a public hospital, 6 months of program. If you go to a private hospital, 9 months of program. So these are high-dose antibiotics also. So that could be, right? This all demotivates a patient to continue treatment with disastrous health consequences. Rather easy. Which of the following statements is the most logical, rational, and crucial message conveyed by the above passage? Read this. First one says, TB is not a curable disease in the Indian circumstances. Firstly, remember, diseases are curable and manageable, right? Firstly, there is a cure for TB. It's just that people, for one or the other reason, are dropping out of it, right? It is still curable. That means you can say there is a medication for this which can cure it. Yes, right? It's not a cure. It's not to say that it's not a curable disease. Disease is evidently curable. B is curing TB requires more than diagnosis and medical treatment. Yes, support from family members, right? You can say destigmatization of the disease, motivating the patient to continue with the treatment. So many more things rather than just diagnosis and medical treatment. So this looks okay. C says government's surveillance mechanism is deficient and poor people have no access to treatment. Nowhere does the passage talk about government surveillance method, right? D says India will be free from diseases like TB only when its poverty alleviation programs are effectively and successfully implemented. Firstly, he says India mein majority of TB patients are poor. That does not mean all TB patients are poor. And secondly, it's not just that there are adverse health consequences only for the poor. Right? It's also for the rich. I told you that stigma associated with TB, side effects will also be for the rich and also be for the poor. Some people may feel demotivated to continue with the treatment. Right? So India will be free from TB only when its poverty alleviation programs. This is to assume that the rich do everything right, right? Which could be the case, but we don't know. The passage does not go about how the rich people deal with it, right? So you cannot say this. Between A and D, if there is a choice, between B and D, it has to be B, right? Is there a passage that I left? This one. Okay. Reading comprehension would be 26 to 28 questions, which is exactly 67 to 70 marks. Right? Okay. What stands in the way of widespread and careful adoption of genetic modification technology is an intellectual property rights regime that seeks to create private monopolies for such technologies. Right? Which is say, The careful adoption of GM technology, the widespread use of GM technology, it's hindered by what? It's hindered by an IPR regime. What does this IPR regime do? It seeks to create private monopolies for such technologies. If GM technology is largely corporate driven, it seeks to maximize profits, that too in the short run. That is why corporations make major investments in herbicide tolerant and pest resistant crops. Such properties only have a short window. As soon enough, pests and weeds will be able to evolve to overcome this resistance. This suits the corporations. Why? Because they will then come out with newer commodities to sell. Right? The National Farmers Commission pointed out that priority must be given in genetic modification to incorporation of genes that can help impart resistance to drought, salinity, and other stresses. Right? Which is to say, do not only go for those things, right, for which there is a short window so that you can continue to produce more and more products and sell them off. There should be some priority given to these things. Right? Now look at the questions. The first one says, which of the following is the most logical and rational crucial message conveyed by the passage? Public research institutions should take a lead in GM technology and prioritize the technology agenda. Right? In terms of research institutions, what is the current status of public research institutions? You cannot say. He says, if it is monopolized by private corporations, this is what they are going to do. Right? So he's pointing out that it should not be entirely left in the hands of private corporations. That is one problem. But what about public research institutions? We cannot say just yet. But Firbi, let's consider it. Right? It's not evidently wrong also. Right? Let's read the other ones. B says, developing countries should raise this issue in WTO and ensure the abolition of intellectual property rights. Firstly, is it about developing versus developed? No, right? Clearly not there. And secondly, abolition of intellectual property rights is too extreme a solution. Yes, it'll kill innovation, right? There is a reason for which there is an IPR regime. Right? You must, because one regime could be favorable to some does not mean you have to be eliminating that regime completely. It's called throwing the baby out of the bath with the bathwater, right? C says private corporations should not be allowed to do agri-business in India, particularly in the seed business. Once again, that completely extreme set. You should regulate them. You should monitor as to what they are doing. You should not completely tell them, no, you cannot do any business in India. D says present Indian circumstances do not favor the cultivation of genetically modified crops. Right? Present Indian circumstances do not favor the cultivation of genetically modified crops. No, he's not talking about whether agriculture right now there are GM crops which are being cultivated or not. He's trying to tell you something else completely, right? Not this. By elimination, A is the right answer, right? The others are so evidently wrong that A becomes the right answer, right? Which is what I was telling. If you're trying to go into thinking, oh, this is what he was hinting at, then you are going to find a problem here, right? Then you're going to say everything is the right option, right? Go for the wrong ones. On the basis of the above passage, following assumptions have been made. The issue of effects of natural calamities on agriculture is not given due consideration by GM technology companies. Second, in the long run, GM technology will not be able to solve agricultural problems arising due to global warming. Second is correct. Remember, he's talking about GM technology. Whoever is developing this technology, they are only trying to consider those problems which are short-lived, right? They're trying to come up with solutions which are short-lived. Why? Because they want to sell so much more, right? That's why they want to maximize profits. That does not mean technology right now is not enough for you to solve agricultural problems that will arise due to global warming. That's a problem, right? That you are not commodifying this is another problem, right? Whether the technology right now cannot solve problems related to global warming is not something which has been mentioned in the passage, right? वो mention नहीं किया हुआ. What they're only hinting at is if GM technology is monopolized by private sector corporations, then they're going to push those products which help them seek maximum profits. They're only going to be concentrating in those businesses which they know, right, will have a very short life, right? So that they continue to, we can say, produce more and more commodities to sell them off, right? 2 definitely should not be the answer. Look at first. First one says the issue of effects of natural calamities on agriculture is not given due importance by GM technology companies, right? This is what the NFC was pointing out. Priority must be given. Last one, dekho. This suits the corporations. The National Farmers Commission pointed out that priority must be given in genetic modification to incorporation of genes that can help impart resistance to drought, salinity, and other stresses. That means if the NFC is telling you that you must give priority to these areas, That means they're not giving priority to these areas. Otherwise, why would it state the obvious, right? Answer should be 1 only. Next, this is also a very interesting passage, right? Too many passages around climate, you are saying, right? Most invasive species are neither terribly successful nor very harmful, right? Ordinarily, once again, he used certain passages on climate change where he was not overtly critical. Here, in fact, he went into certain passages where he's trying to talk about privatization mein quota. He's also not overtly critical there. Here also, he's trying to tell you that most invasive species are neither terribly successful nor very harmful. One, they're not very harmful, right, as is being proclaimed. Second, they're not terribly successful in one. Successful in colonizing certain areas. Right? They're not very successful. You just say they are not really too invasive. Right? Britain's invasive plants are not widespread, right? Not spreading especially quickly, not and often less of a nuisance than vigorous natives, such as bracken. Right? Which is to say, in Britain, there are some invasive plants which are not very widespread, right? Which is to say, they have not invaded a lot of ecosystems. Second, they're not spreading even at a very fast rate. Third, they may be less of a problem than your natives, right? Like he gives an example like bracken. The arrival of new species almost always increases the biological diversity. This is exactly what biodiversity basically means, right? Only in terms of numbers, right? Arrival of new species almost always increases biological diversity in a region. In many cases, a flood of newcomers drives no native species to extinction, right? One reason, firstly, the arrival of new species almost always increases biological diversity in a region. In many cases, a flood of newcomers drives no native species to extinction, which is to say, invasive species ka meaning kya hoga? They would invade a certain ecosystem and the existing native plants will be driven out or towards extinction. That is going to lead to a reduction in biological diversity. What he's basically trying to tell you here is that invasive species almost always lead to an increase in biological diversity. How? Because they do not drive any native species to extinction. Some of them. He's not talking about everyone. Right? Next, he says one reason is that invaders tend to colonize disturbed habitats like polluted lakes and post-industrial wastelands where little else anyway lives. Right? They are nature's opportunists. Right? He has written this passage more in support of native species, or he would not say in support of native species. He's trying to tell you that they're not as harmful as they make it, or other people make it seem. Right? This is what he's hinting at. Yes, not even downplaying. He's not going into what negative impacts would be. He's only trying to make you aware that this problem is not as severe as it may appear to you. The word is invasive. You may think of a negative connotation straight up, but it's not that bad. This is what he's hinting at. Which of the following is the most logical and rational inference? First one says, invasive species should be used to rehabilitate desert areas and wastelands of a country. Should you? Right. See, invasive species are invasive for a reason. Right? He's only trying to tell you, this problem is not as bad. He's not trying to tell you, use this problem actually to create biological diversity. Should be used to rehabilitate desert areas and wastelands. This is being recommendatory. He's not making any recommendations. Right? B says, laws against introduction of foreign plants are unnecessary. Firstly, do we even know whether laws against foreign plants exist? You may know from your understanding of general studies, but does the passage even talk about that? Right? What is your reason or what is the evidence for you to imagine that there are laws against foreign plants? Right? Beyond the scope. C says, sometimes campaigns against foreign plants are pointless. Right? This is exactly what he's trying to hint at. Invasive ka matlab kya? They're not native. Right? Secondly, he's saying sometimes. He's not saying all of these invasive species are good. He said most of them are not as harmful as they make it seem. Right? D says, foreign plants should be used to increase the biodiversity of a country. Once again, remember, he's trying to tell you that there is a certain problem. This problem is not as bad. He's not telling you, oh, this problem is not so bad. You should actually use it as a solution. No. Right? He's not recommending that foreign plants should be used to increase the biodiversity of a country. Right? Because some of the foreign plants may even lead to extinction. Right? By elimination, it should be C. This is one of the passages that most people are going to get wrong. Right? Yeah, most people are going to get this wrong. Because they have to pick the tone of the author also. Okay. Diarrheal deaths amongst Indian children are mostly due to food and water contamination. Right? Amongst the Indian children, deaths due to diarrhea are mostly due to food and water contamination. Use of contaminated groundwater, unsafe chemicals in agriculture, poor hygiene in storage and handling of food items, to food cooked and distributed in unhygienic surroundings. There are myriad, which is to say there are many factors that need regulation and monitoring. Which is to say food contamination can come from any source, and there are too many sources, therefore there is a need for regulation and monitoring. People need to have awareness of adulteration and ways of complaining to the relevant authorities. Right? People need to be aware that there can be adulteration, and they must have redressal mechanisms too. There should be a way that they could complain to the relevant authorities. Surveillance of foodborne diseases involves a number of government agencies and entails a good training of inspection staff, because food contamination can happen at many layers or many levels. There would involve a lot of government agencies, right? And also a training of this inspection staff. Considering the proportion of the urban population that depends on street food for its daily meals, investing in training and education of street vendors is also of great importance. Right? He's trying to tell you that food contamination is a problem. There are multiple sources of food contamination. Therefore, there is a need for an effective regulatory oversight and surveillance mechanisms. Right? He's only being recommendatory here. What should be done? Right? On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one, he says, right, once again, combinations, pick one which is evidently wrong. First one says, food safety is a complex issue that calls for a multi-pronged solution. Yes, of course, this is what he's saying. Too many sources, multiple agencies, coordination, training, right? Has to be a multi-pronged solution. Not evidently wrong. Second, he says is great investments need to be made in developing the manpower for surveillance and training. Of course, because it will entail too many agencies, and inspection is also necessary, or you can say surveillance is necessary. A lot of money could be spent on their training. Not evidently wrong. 3 is India needs to make sufficient legislation for governing food processing industry. Firstly, why only food processing industry? Right? Secondly, what in the passage tells you that there is no existing legislation? Right? Is there any evidence in the passage that says that there is no legislation in the first place? Secondly, why only the food processing industry? Right? There could be multiple sources from which contamination can happen, right from the way you use groundwater or you use fertilizer and pesticides. Why not regulate them? Why not have a legislation there? But more importantly, the reason is this. Right? You do not know whether there is an existing legislation or not, right? Because the passage does not go there at all, right? So you use 3 to eliminate. This goes, this goes, this goes. Answer is 1 and 2, right? This is the best way of doing it. Pick up something which is evidently wrong, use it to eliminate, reduce your choices. This is very easy, this passage. The interests of the working and the poor people have historically been neglected in the planning of our cities. Right? Which is to say, when we plan our cities, we do not take into account the interests of the working people and the poor people. Right? Our cities are increasingly intolerant, unsafe, and unlivable places for large number of citizens, yet we continue to plan via the old ways. Which is to say, we are still reliant on old ways of planning our cities. The static development plan that draws exclusively from technical expertise, distance from people's life experiences and needs, and actively excluding a large number of people, places, activities, and practices that are an integral part of the city. Right? Which is to say, he's basically highlighting the way we plan our cities, right, that is outdated. Right? It actively excludes some people, yet we continue to be doing the same. The passage seems to argue, first is against the monopoly of builders and interests of the elite groups. Now, firstly, he says that some groups their interests are not included. Does not mean these groups, which the passage does not even mention, right, that these people have a monopoly, right? So you cannot say this. B is against the need for global and smart cities. Once again, global and smart cities, right? And against the need for global and smart cities, beyond the scope of the passage. C says, in favor of planning cities mainly for the poor and working. The fact that the interests of working and poor people are not included does not mean the solution is now we should develop cities only or mainly for the interests of these people. That is what you call reverse snobbery, right? which is say some people have been corrupt, give me a chance to also be corrupt. That's not how you solve these questions. D is in favor of participation of people's groups in city planning. This is exactly the more moderate, right? Which is say you have to include people's life experiences also, right? Yes, more is about inclusiveness. He's not trying to hint at only a certain category of people. This is very easy. Next one is a vast majority of Indians are poor, with barely 10% employed in the organized sector. Now, this is a very interesting passage. A vast majority of Indians are poor. Barely 10% are employed in the organized sector. We are being convinced that vigorous economic growth is generating substantial employment. We are being convinced. Right? He's saying the narrative is being set that vigorous growth generates substantial employment. But this is not so. Right? Every time there is a but, he's going to go a little contrarian. When our economy was growing at a 3% per year, the employment in the organized sector was growing at 2% per year. As the economy began to grow at a 7 to 8% per year, the rate of growth of employment in the organized sector actually declined to 1% per year. This is most jobless growth he's hinting at. Right? Basically, what he's saying is, against the most popular narrative that vigorous growth creates employment, that is, there is no empirical evidence behind it. In fact, the evidence only points to the contrary. Right? The question here is, this above passage seems to imply that. First, he says, is most of the modern economic growth is based on technological progress. Second, he says, is much of modern Indian economy does not nurture sufficient symbiotic relationship with labor-intensive, natural resource-based livelihoods. 3, he says, is service sector in India is not very labor intensive. 4, he says, is literal rural population is not willing to enter the organized sector. Right? Which of these should you be picking up? Firstly, this one looks more like he's asking you the reasons behind any of those. The passage does not go there at all. The passage only tells you that in India, firstly, he tries to talk to you about organized sector ki employment in general. That's what he starts with. Right? Majority of India are not employed in the organized sector. Then he's trying to tell you the most common narrative is that growth creates employment. But if you actually look at our own history, when we were growing at a 2%, organized sector employment was also growing at 1 to 2%. But this has actually declined when we started to grow more vigorously. Right? Nowhere in the passage does he go into what could be the reasons behind it. This is why UPSC's reading comprehensions are different. Right? You need to then apply your economic logic to these questions. Right? Now tell me, how do you go about this one? The first one, does it make economic sense to you? Does it make sense to you? Right? Most of the growth, if it is on technological progress, technological impact is that it replaces human labor. That could be one of the reasons behind unemployment, right? But remember, in these questions, you have to find out something which is evidently wrong. Which of these is evidently wrong? He's saying literate rural population is not willing to enter the organized sector. Now, that does not make any sense to you, right? Why do you think literate rural population is not willing to enter organized sector? If you had said that this literate rural population is finding it difficult to enter the organized sector, that makes sense. Why would they not be willing to enter the organized sector? That does not make economic sense to you. So you use 4 to eliminate. Straight up the answer would be. Huh? 4 is evidently wrong. 4 says literate rural population is not willing to enter the organized sector. Right? There is very little reason for you to believe that literate people, rural people will not be willing. Oh, acha, sorry. not this one. So, yes. Sorry. Right. On the basis of this, 4 is evidently wrong. That means, jahan 4 hoga, eliminate that. You eliminate one option B and option D. Now you have 1 and 2, 1, 2 and 3. Right? Yes. Now you have to check 3. 1 and 2 are correct. Check for be 1 and 2. First one says most of the modern economic growth is based on technological progress. That makes sense because technology replaces human labor. That could be leading to, you can say, growth, but at the same time, not enough employment. Second says much of the modern Indian society does not nurture sufficient symbiotic relationship with labor-intensive, natural resource-based livelihoods. This is one of the reasons why there must be less employment being generated. 3 says service sector in India is not very labor-intensive. Right? Service sector in India is also not very labor intensive. It's also completely true. Right? It has to be C. See, this is how passages in UPSC will be different. Right? Why? Because now you have to apply economic logic to these passages. Right? This is not like, oh, fact finding from the passage itself and then going down. You need to know what organized sector means. You need to know some reasons as to why employment may be generated, may not be generated. You need to have that sense of logic. This is why you will not find this kind of a reading comprehension in any other exam except for UPSC. Right? Look at the next one. Once again, economics. It says India has banking correspondents who help bring people in the hinterland into the banking fold. Right? Do you know what banking correspondents are? Think of them as agents of sorts. Just much like you have LIC agents, you also have what you call banking correspondents. In areas where it is very, you can say, not economically viable for you to have a brick and mortar banking facility, in which case you have agents, persons who act like banks on behalf of certain banks. These are called banking correspondents. What do they do? They help bring people in the hinterland, which is to say the far-flung regions, right, into the formal banking system. For them to succeed, banks cannot crimp on costs. If this has to succeed, the idea of banking correspondents, banks should then not be crimping on, you can say, or reducing costs or thinking too much about costs therein. They also cannot afford to ignore investing in financial education and literacy. Right? Financial education and literacy, both are banking correspondents and also the local people, as to why should they be having formal accounts. Banking correspondents are way too small to be viewed as a systemic risk. Right? Which is say, in terms of cost, it's not like banking correspondents give you the most amount of business. They are way too small for the banking industry. So they cannot be a systemic risk here. Yet, India's banking regulator has restricted them to serving only one bank. Right? Which is say, India banking regulator is who? It is the RBI that has restricted them to serving only one bank. Which is to say, you can be a banking correspondent for one bank only. Right? Perhaps to prevent arbitrage. Right? He's not saying this is the reason. He's speculating that this is the reason. What is arbitrage? Arbitrage means having different prices of the same commodity, right? What could be a reason arbitrage here? If you could be representing two banks, right? Two banks may have their own services. One could be, for example, giving you a higher rate of interest. Or, for example, sometimes banks also engage in, let's say, cross-selling. Right? One bank has an insurance plan, the other also has an insurance plan. Right? It's the same kind of insurance. One bank is offering it at a higher premium, the other is offering at a lower premium. For a banking correspondent, some element would involve incentives, right, to cross-sell something which is more costly. Right? That is one of the reasons, perhaps one of the reasons, right, that the author is speculating behind why the RBI has told them to serve only one bank. Efforts at banking outreach may succeed only if there are better incentives at work for such last mile workers, and also those providers who ensure not just basic bank accounts, but also products such as accident and life insurance and micro pension schemes. Which is to say, banking outreach is only going to expand if you facilitate banking correspondence. Right? They do not just help you provide basic bank accounts, they're also cross-selling. Right? This is called other financial services offered by the banks. Right? This is what he's hinting at. Now, look at the questions. Which of the following is the most logical and rational or crucial inference here? First one says, efforts to bring people into India's hinterland, into the banking system, are not successful. Right? You cannot say this is not successful. Right now, he's only pointing to you certain problems with them. Right? Firstly, he's hinting that banks cannot crimp on these costs because these are important functionaries. Second thing he says is, regulator has restricted them to serving only one bank. Towards the end, he's saying there should be better conditions of work for them also. Right? He is advocating that some problems need to be addressed. He's not saying that right now, India mein hinterland mein banking system is not successful at all. Right? That he does not go into at all. It could be more successful if you could have better incentives for banking correspondence. Although right? Because he's saying not successful, that should be reason enough for you to believe that this may not be right so much. B says, for meaningful financial inclusion, India's banking system needs more number of banking correspondents and other such light markers. Once again, he's not saying the numbers of banking correspondents are lesser. He's only and only trying to talk to you about better incentives at work, right? Whether banking correspondents are less in number, whether they are less proportionate to the needs, the passage does not go there at all. He's hinted at certain problems, policy level problems that they should be allowed, for example, to work for multiple banks, right? And then better conditions of work for them. He's nowhere mentioned that we have less number of banking correspondents, right? That is something which is important, right? More number, we cannot say on the basis of the passage. C says, meaningful financial inclusion in India requires that banking correspondents have diverse skills. Not bad at all, right? Because they also have to cross-sell. Financial literacy is also important. D says better banking outreach would be impossible unless each banking correspondent is allowed to serve a number of banks. Right? He says, he's not directly telling you that, right? If you think about it, between C and D is saying would be possible unless each banking correspondent is allowed to serve a number of banks. If the regulator has restricted them in terms of serving only one bank, there must be a reason for it, right? Right. Now, when he's saying that the reason you can have a better banking outreach is if you allow them to serve multiple banks, there could be problems there also, right? There are other incentives at work here too, right? Between C and D, if you have to pick something, has to be then C, right? C is much lesser controversial for you, right? It's only saying that better banking correspondents should have diverse skills, right? Now we are going to go towards the ending half. Okay. Now, if you find passages which look this big, these are typically the easiest passages. The only intent behind them to give you these passages is for you to use more time up, right? India's economic footprint, given its population, remains small compared to the US, EU, or China, which is say India in terms of economy is smaller compared to US, European Union, and China, given its population. Right? It has much to learn from other economies, yet must implement solutions that fit its unique circumstances, which is to say, we should not just blindly copy other economies. We should also value our own circumstances, right? We should have customized solutions for our own unique circumstances. India especially needs an effective long-term regulatory system based on collaboration rather than the current top-down approach, which is say, is he arguing against a regulatory system? No. He says India needs a regulatory system which should be effective, right? It should be based on collaboration rather than the current top-down approach, which is say, it could not be that the government is holding a certain sector at ransom, right? It should be more on collaboration. You should also speak to the sector that you're trying to regulate, right? Regulations seek desirable outcomes, yet are repeatedly used as political tools to push one agenda or the other. Often, regulations fail to consider impacts on jobs and economic growth or less restrictive alternatives. Regulations may be used to protect local markets at the expense of more widely shared prosperity in the future. Additionally, regulations inevitably result in numerous unintended consequences. In today's hyper-competitive global economy, regulations need to be viewed as weapons that seek cost-justified social and environmental benefits while improving the economic well-being of most citizens. So he is pointing out that there is a problem with the current regulatory regime. He's not saying you have to get away with regulation, you have to get done with it. He's trying to tell you that you have to reform this regulatory system, amend it, right? Look at the question. This is very hard to pick the tone, right? You must have some sense of India's economic history as to how regulatory you were at least till 1991 and even right now, right? You need to have that in your mind when you're reading this passage, right, as to what he's implying. Right? Do you require regulation? Yes, you do, but it cannot be strangulating a certain sector also, right? Which of the following is the most logical, rational, and crucial inference that can be derived from the above passage? A good example in this case would be a regulation. For example, he does mention something like an import substitution, import reduction. Right? Import substitution, import reduction was one regulation or was one regulatory policy of sorts. Right? Why was it done? The argument was infant industry. Right? Which is your industries may be infants, right? It will be unfair for them to be competing with the outside world right now. That may lead to killing of your industry. But that created a lot of problems, right? You could not use economies of scale of other countries. You're not working towards your comparative advantage also, right? Which is to say, yes, there are some sound rationale behind regulations, but regulations should be, they should be conceived better, and then they should be implemented in a better manner. That's what he's hinting at. Which of the following is the most logical and rational crucial inference that can be derived from the above passage? First one says, a better regulatory system will help India achieve the size of economy appropriate to its population. Does this look evidently wrong? It does not look evidently wrong. So I'm not going to straight up mark this as wrong. B says, in a competitive global economy, India must use its regulations strategically. Towards the end, he does say that it can be used. Wait a minute, let's find something which is a little more irrelevant. C says, regulations in India do not favor its integration with today's hyper-competitive global economy. Right? Is it right? Is it wrong? Does he talk about integration with the rest of the world? He does not talk about that. He's only concerned with domestic economies primarily. He's not telling you that regulations hinder your integration with the rest of the world at all. Right? This is beyond the scope of the passage. This is evidently wrong. D says, job creation and economic growth should be dominant considerations in developing India's regulatory system. Right? One aspect of regulatory system is being addressed here. He's not spoken of. What he's saying is sometimes we do not consider its impact on jobs. Sometimes we do not look at less restrictive policies because we're too concerned with regulating a system. That does not mean job creation and economic growth should be the dominant concern, right? This is something that you wouldn't say this is wrong, right? But the fact is, should be the dominant consideration would mean other considerations are secondary to this one, right? That the passage does not go into, right? Now between A and B, right? First is a better regulatory system will help India achieve the size of economy appropriate to its population. What in the passage tells you that right now India does not have an economy appropriate to the size of its population? First line says India's economic footprint still remains small compared to the US, European Union and China. Compared to them, right? यहाँ से देख लो, India's economic footprint given its population still remains small compared to US, European Union and China. So it's written in a comparative sense, right? He's saying right now you do not have an economy which is appropriate to the size of your population, right? That is something that you can use as, this is nitpicking, right? But this is something between A and B. You have to pick something, right? A, you have some reason to believe that what about the passage tells you that we do not have a economy appropriate to the size of our population. For B says India must use its regulations strategically. He says towards the end, in today's hyper-competitive global economy, regulations need to be viewed as weapons, right, that seek cost-justified and social environmental benefits while improving the economic well-being of most citizens. Which is to say, there are some benefits of regulations also, but you cannot just be too regulatory as well. Right? You should view them, for example, infant industry is a strong economic argument, right? But you have to also consider other considerations as well. So this between A and B, if you have to pick something, it should be B, right? Now this is something that most likely you're going to get wrong because of oversight, right? That is going to happen. On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, in today's global economy, regulations are not effectively used to protect local markets. Second, social and environmental concerns are generally ignored by governments across the world while implementing regulations. Firstly, he says, in today's global economy, regulations are not effectively used to protect local markets. Even if it's global economy, what is there? He's saying they're not used effectively to protect local markets. What he's saying is protectionism is a sound rationale, right? But it cannot be the only rationale. You have to view it strategically. Nowhere is he saying that regulations are not being effectively used to protect local markets. In fact, what he's arguing is you should not be too regulatory also. Right? There is a sound rationale behind regulations, but a little more optimism will do. Right? It should be more collaborative. That is what he's hinting at. Right? Nowhere is he saying that they are not using regulations effectively to protect local markets. So not this. B says social and environmental concerns are generally ignored by the governments across the world while implementing regulations. One, he says governments across the world. right? What in the passage tells you that governments across the world are ignoring social and environmental considerations, right, while implementing regulations, right? That is not being said here. India especially needs this. See, this is written in the Indian context. Secondly, often regulations fail to consider impacts on job and economic growth or less restrictive alternatives. Regulations may be used to protect local markets at the expense of more widely shared prosperity in the future. See, this is the one that makes the first statement wrong, that you are using regulations to protect the local market at the expense of your future prosperity. So that means that regulations are not being effectively used to protect local markets. You are protecting local markets, you are being too protective also. Right? Second is social and environmental concerns are generally ignored by the governments across the world while implementing regulations. No, there is no evidence in the passage that says something like this. Not one, not two. Answer would be neither one, not two. Move to the next one. I think now we have the last few. There are too many of these, huh? Banking correspondence we have done. Meaningful financial inclusion we have done. अच्छा 54 में कहाँ घुस गए हम लोग? हाँ, this one. This is one of the more important ones. Right? In a study, scientists compared the microbiomes of poorly nourished and well-nourished infants and young children. Microbiomes matlab the microorganisms that live within your body. There is a study. In the study, scientists compared microbiomes of two categories. One, poorly nourished children, and well-nourished infants and young children. Right? Two, you can say, sample groups here. Right? Gut microbes were isolated from the fecal samples of the malnourished and healthy children. Right? Where did you get your gut microbes from? From the fecal samples of both these malnourished and healthy children. The microbiome was immature and less diverse in malnourished children compared to the better developed, mature microbiome found in the healthy children of the same age. Right? According to some studies, the chemical composition of mother's milk has shown the presence of a modified sugar, sialylated oligosaccharides. This is not utilized by the baby for its own nutrition. However, the bacteria constituting the infant's microbiome thrive on this sugar, which serves as their food. Which is to say, in mother's milk, there is something which is a modified sugar. The sugar is not utilized by the baby for its development. This sugar is rather utilized by the infant's microbiome. There are bacteria in the infant's body. They utilize it, right, for their own requirements. Malnourished mothers have very low levels of this sugar in their milk. Consequently, the microbiomes of their infants fail to mature. That in turn leads to malnourished babies, right? Firstly, he's trying to hint at, there is a study. Study mein microbiomes of two categories of children were studied. Those who are well-nourished, those who are not very well-nourished, poorly nourished. He's not saying poor, he's saying poorly nourished, right? Then he says what happened is the microbiome was more mature in case of the wealthy, or not wealthy, in case of the well-developed or well-nourished children. It was less mature in case of the malnourished infants. Then he tells you the reason behind it, or one of the possible reasons behind it. The reason is that mother's milk has a certain sugar. This sugar is not utilized by the baby, but by bacteria in the gut microbiome of this baby, right? That could be the reason why, because if you look at malnourished mothers, they have less of this sugar in their milk. Consequently, their babies will have a malnourished or a less mature microbiome. Question says, which of the following is the most logical, rational, and crucial inference that can be derived from the above passage? First one says, if malnourished condition in children is caused by gut bacteria, it cannot be treated. Firstly, malnourished condition in children is caused by gut bacteria. It cannot be treated. Firstly, gut microbiome, or you can say microbiome in a body, could be the reason behind malnourishment. That is one. What in your text says it cannot be treated, right? Nothing in the passage says it cannot be treated. B says the guts of malnourished babies should be inoculated with mature microbiomes. It should be injected with mature microbiomes. Now he is hinting that the problem lies with the mother's milk. That the mother is malnourished is the reason why the babies are also malnourished. Right? That does not mean the solution would be to inject this microbiome into the babies of or into these infants. No, you don't want to do that. You want to address the problem. Right? The main problem is that the mothers are malnourished. Right? This is not the solution that you're going to propose. C says babies of malnourished mothers should be fed with dairy milk fortified with silated oligosaccharides instead of mother's milk. Once again, this is then if this is the solution, why not this? Right? If you have to give them an alternative milk which has, you can say oligosaccharides, these silated oligosaccharides, right? Why should this not be? Then why should this not be a solution? Right? The problem is with the mother's milk, that mothers do not have this in their diet. So the addressal of the problem has to come from mothers per se. D says research on benign effects of gut bacteria on nutrition has policy implications. Right? Is this correct? Not correct. Is this correct? Not correct. D says research on the benign effects of gut bacteria on nutrition has policy implications. Of course, it will have policy implications. If you have to solve malnourishment, right, you have to concentrate on mothers. Right? This was found out by this study per se. Right? It will have policy implications, which is say, if you have to address malnutrition, you will have to focus on the health of the child and also of the mother. Right? You will have to develop policies to that effect. Answer should be D. Next one says, on the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First is probiotic probiotic foods are a solution to treat the children suffering from malnutrition due to immature gut bacteria composition. Second, the babies of malnourished mothers generally tend to be malnourished. Once again, the passage only points out that the problem lies here, does not tell you what the solution is. Right? So you cannot say processed probiotic foods would be a solution. We don't know. Right? Second is the babies of malnourished mothers generally tend to be malnourished. Absolutely correct. 2 has to be correct. Right? Temperatures have risen nearly 5 times rapidly on the western Antarctic Peninsula. They have risen, and they have risen 5 times as rapidly than the global average over the past 5 decades. Researchers have now found out that melting glaciers are causing a loss of species diversity amongst the benthos in coastal waters of the Antarctic Peninsula, impacting an entire seafloor ecosystem. They believe increased level of suspended sediment in water to be the cause of dwindling biodiversity in the coastal regions. Right? Firstly, he tries to talk about temperature rising in the western Antarctic Peninsula much faster than the global average. Secondly, he is trying to tell you what the impact there is. Right? On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, regions of glaciers warm faster than the other regions due to global warming. The fact that there is one, you can say, glacial region, right, that is warming faster does not mean that this is the norm. Right? You cannot extrapolate this finding to all glacial regions across the world. You can use 1 to eliminate. Now you have 3 only and 2 only. Now 3 is correct, 2 has to be checked. 3 is melting glaciers can reduce the marine biodiversity in some areas. Of course, he's clearly giving an example. He's saying can reduce. He's not saying reduces always. Can reduce. Clearly there is an example. Second says global warming can lead to a seafloor sedimentation in some areas. Right? Because he said, he used the word benthos here. Right? Benthos is that seafloor ke closer region, aphotic zone, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not an expert in geography, but I think benthic would mean the bottom one. Right? That means, and he's clearly also said that suspended sediment is leading to dwindling biodiversity. 2 is also correct. Answer should be 2 and 3. Right? So some of you may be confused by seafloor. If you know the meaning of benthos, right, you are going to get this answer right. Okay. A research team examined a long-term owl roost. Owls prey on small mammals and excreted remains of those meals that accumulated over the time. Okay, A research team examined a long-term owl roost. Okay. Owls prey on small mammals, and the excreted remains of those meals that accumulated over the time provide us an insight into the composition and structure of small mammals over the past millennia. Which is say, owls prey on small mammals. When they excrete whatever they could not digest, this excreted remains is then used to find out the composition and structure of small mammals over the past millennia. Right? Wow. The research suggested that when the Earth went through a period of rapid warming about 13,000 years ago, the small mammal community was stable and resilient. But from the last quarter of the 19th century, human-made changes to the environment had caused an enormous drop in biomass and energy flow. This dramatic decline in energy flow means that modern ecosystems are not adapting as easily as they did in the past, right? So this owl is not important. The findings are important. He has mentioned owls only because they prey on certain small mammals, and their excreta is used, right, as you can say as material to find out about the composition and structure of small mammals over time. Then he tells you what has happened to the composition and structure of small mammals over time, right? When the Earth went through a period of rapid warming about 13,000 years ago, small mammal community was still stable and resilient. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, human-made changes to the environment have caused such an enormous drop in biomass and energy flow. This means that modern ecosystems are not adapting as easily as they did in the past. That means possibly he's hinting at accelerated changes, right, induced by humans. On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, global warming is a frequently occurring natural phenomenon. Second, firstly, frequently occurring natural phenomenon. He's clearly hinted at anthropogenic causes, human-induced changes also. So you use 1 to eliminate. Now you have 3 only and 2 and 3 only. 3 is correct, 2 you have to check. 2 says, the impending global warming will not adversely affect small mammals. It is going to affect small mammals, right? Clearly, it is wrong. Answer should be 3 only, right? Food varieties extinction is happening all over the world, and it is happening fast. So food varieties extinction, right? He's not saying food extinction, he's saying varieties extinction is happening across the world. So it's not endemic to a specific region, and it is happening fast. For example, of the 7,000 apple varieties that were grown during the 19th century, fewer than 100 remain now. He's not saying apples have gotten extinct. Various varieties of apple have gotten extinct, right? In the Philippines, thousands of varieties of rice once thrived. Now only up to 100 are grown there. In China, 90% of wheat varieties cultivated just a century ago have disappeared. Farmers in the past painstakingly bred and developed crops well suited to the peculiarities of their local climate and environment. In the recent past, our heavy dependence on few high-yielding varieties and technology-driven production and distribution of food is causing the dwindling of diversity in food crops. If some mutating crop disease or future climate change decimates the few crop plants we have come to depend on to feed our growing population, we might desperately need some of those varieties we have let go extinct. So he's basically trying to tell you the importance of diversity of plants that you had. Now you are too dependent on a few varieties, right? You should focus on these diversities as well. Why? Because if there is any infestation that leads to a destruction of your existing few varieties, right, that is going to be problematic. And this is also something that you read in agriculture anyway, right? It's not something that is out of the ordinary. On the basis of the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. First one says, humans have been the main reason for a large-scale extinction of plant species, right? Where is he saying humans have been the main reason for the extinction, right? Second says, consumption of food mainly from locally cultivated crops ensures crop diversity. No, right? Consumption of food from locally cultivated crops ka meaning kya hua? Ensures local diversity. Right? He's saying consumption of food mainly from local cultivated crops. Like there could be a region which does not cultivate anything, right? It is the reason that ensures crop diversity. 3 says the present style of production and distribution of food will finally lead to problem of food scarcity in the near future. Firstly, he's saying will finally lead to problem of food scarcity in the near future. May need. It may, if there is any infestation. D says our food security may depend on our ability to preserve the locally cultivated varieties of crops. This is okay, right? Not a problem. First one he says is humans have been the main reason for the large-scale extinction of animals and plant species. Have humans been responsible? Is he saying something like this? He says something like farmers in the past painstakingly did the in the recent past, our heavy dependence on few high-yielding varieties and technology-driven production and distribution of crops is causing the diversity in food crops, right? Is it large-scale extinction of plant species? Firstly, large-scale extinction of plant species or diversity of food crops. If you ask me, humans have been the main reason for the large-scale extinction of plant species. I would say this is a little too extreme. Priestley is only trying to talk about food crops. You had varieties of food crops. Now, because you're dependent on a few, right, that has led to extinction, or you can say, yes, right. Humans are the reason you had varieties, right? Now you have come to depend on a few only, right? But he's saying large-scale extinction of plant species, right? If you ask me, I wouldn't recommend this as an answer. I could use 1 to eliminate. If you use 1 to eliminate, this goes. Now you have 2 and 4, 2, 3, 2 and 3. 4 is okay. 4 is all right. What is 3? 3 says the present side of production and distribution will finally lead to a problem of food scarcity. No, it will not will. Definitely nahi. If there is any infestation, chances are that it could. Right? Not this. Answer should be consumption of food mainly from local cultivated crops ensures crop diversity. Fair enough. Answer should be 2 and 4. B, not this. Right. Now, I wasn't very sure of 2 as an answer, right? But I have to look for something which is evidently wrong, right? Something which is evidently wrong, I'm going to use it to eliminate. Then, given whatever choices I have to pick the best one. We are done with this. Right? 2019 is over. A lot of time has also passed.